welcome to the Merri-Cast, the show that puts you on the fast track to business confidence. Every week we interview those who start and build companies, but we don't often think about what a company is actually there to do. For some, it's just about making money, but for a rapidly growing number, there's a much wider purpose. My guest this week couldn't be better qualified to talk about this subject. Mark Goyder founded Tomorrow's Company 30 years ago. He has many talents, though he is perhaps best known for his work in the fields of corporate governance, social responsibility, and sustainability. What is striking about Mark is that while many of these issues are mainstream today, it was Mark who was banging the drum on them all those years ago, and I think it's taken the rest of us a long time to catch up with him. Mark is also an entrepreneur in his own right, so he's had his own ups and downs along his own entrepreneurial journey, and you'll hear all about those too. But first, let's get back to the start. It turns out that Mark came from what sounds like a rather busy and noisy household.
I'm the youngest of 8 children. I think that gives you a certain confidence. Being the youngest is definitely the best place to be in a large family. You tend to have a confidence among your peer group from the start. I had a conventional education, went to Cambridge, but something happened before that which was very formative for me. I happened to meet an inspiring man called Alec Dixon when I was about 15. And I heard him talk at my school about community service, and he had founded voluntary service overseas, VSO, and gone on to found a UK equivalent called Community Service Volunteers. And when I left school, quite young, having got into university, I went to him and his organization and said, I want to volunteer. It was an incredible experience for a 17-year-old to be given responsibility. Went up to a town called Wellington, part of Telford now in Shropshire, asked to organize, liaise between local schools and local needs with the immigrant community, needs with old people, needs with those with learning difficulties. And to be given all that responsibility, I thought I was just academic fodder before this happened. I had this illusion that you didn't do anything useful until you'd got through a degree. Still think far too many people have that illusion now, although the price of the degree is maybe changing that. That gave me huge confidence. I came out of university wanting to work in business, but also fascinated by politics, and spent about 15 years in business, working for the old GC, working for starting in HR, but moving into other areas, especially when I then went to work for 10 years in the paper manufacturing industry, where I was eventually a production manager and did distribution, did warehousing, did customer service, did quality work, did culture change work. And in parallel with that, I got very interested in politics at the time when the young SDP was formed as a sort of social democratic rebellion to the Labour Party. And then came a sort of crossroads moment. It was 1987. I was in my less than 35. I'd been running 2 careers in parallel. One was my business career, for which I got paid, and one was my political career, for which I was actually probably committing almost more time. I'd been a county councillor, so I did actually get elected to something, but I suddenly, after that 87 election, thought, where is all this going? And then another inspiring man appeared on my doorstep, so to speak, a man called Charles Handy. And I'd done a lecture about my belief in the importance of community service as part of the path to adulthood at the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, the RSA. Charles Handy had become chairman. He had identified that the RSA needed somebody with a business background to be their next program director. And he said, why not you? And that was an extraordinary opportunity for me. It just brought together the 2 sides of my career that I'd been in. And I then had a further boost because Charles then said to me shortly afterwards, look, I'm giving a lecture in the autumn, and I was thinking of giving it on the subject, what is a company for? And I remember saying to him, you give the lecture, Charles, I will see what I can do on the back of the lecture. And that, after the Tomorrow's Company inquiry, which we then formed, that became the platform from which Tomorrow's Company as an organization was launched.
Okay, so you've mentioned two kind of role models, if you like, there,
Mm.
sort of, Alex Dixon and Charles Handy. I mean, I'm very fortunate to meet Charles myself, and so I went round to his house once during my magazine days, and so
Yes.
so I'm sort of well acquainted with Charles. But had those two people not come along, either on your doorstep or anywhere else, in your life, then in terms of the nature of tomorrow's company, which we're going to get onto in a minute, in terms of things like that. I mean, was that sort of that kind of perspective or that prism that you had? I mean, it would have been maybe what fundamentally different. So were they fundamental in shaping the kind of business that you were going to go on to found?
Well, I should say that one of the other great influences on my life was both my parents, but my father was a very early pioneer of responsible business. He actually wrote a book in 1951, which was called The Future of Private Enterprise, in which he argued that, it's all very well saying, well, we're morally superior to communism. We have capitalism, but he said, where is the moral legitimacy of capitalism? And he started to probe the very issues that we've seen exposed more and more since. And he also wrote a book in 1961 called The Responsible Company, in which he was the first person in the English language to suggest the idea of a social audit. So as the youngest of eight, I used to have quite grown-up conversations with my dad from my early teens, really, about all of these things. So yes, it was in the bloodstream, and it probably would have come out some other way. I think what Charles Handy added was putting the thing as a question. If you really want to change the world, sometimes instead of making statements and ranting about them, asking open questions is the way to move people. So that I think is the Charles contribution to the way in which I approach the issues. I think the Alec Dixon contribution was the confidence one had, which academic success disables people from having that confidence. And I mean, the work will come to the work tomorrow's company is doing now in 2024, which is all about reaching out to young people who don't have that confidence, the 15-year-olds who have been told implicitly they are failures by school. But what that encounter with Alec Dixon and the doors he opened for me was all about this world of achievement, which is down to your own initiative. So yes, I think it would have happened in other ways, but I think one's very fortunate to meet if I mention my parents, four such inspiring people.
Okay, that's very. You also said something very interesting there that I want to come back to, because when we maybe talk about some of the work you're doing now, particularly around the issue about academic work and how that might take away from confidence. I'm just very interested in that as a line of questioning, maybe a bit later. But let's start with the name, Tomorrow's Company. Is it a bit of a hostage to fortune that you're always having to be looking forward? Because how did was that just an obvious name to you at that point in time? I mean, did you sit around thinking about it for ages or did it just pop out of your head? Oh, yes, that's what we'll call it. And also, were there sort of founding principles that you sort of set out on a scrap of paper or something, when you started?
Well, the honest answer is that I stole the name, but I'll come back to that in a minute. I mean, the link to starting tomorrow's company briefly was that having had Charles Handy ask the question, what is a company for? I literally stood up at the end and said, any RSA fellow interested in pursuing these issues with me, contact me. And we had a whole ferment of activity within the RSA, which is a great sort of 18th century think tank, although going through a few difficulties at the moment. But we, through that, started to hold this. In 1992, we held a series of dinner dialogues where, using the big names around the RSA, people like, do you remember John Harvey Jones?
Yes.
A former chairman of ICI. He was one of our vice presidents, and he was wonderfully supportive and hosted the first ever dinner. We had people at it like those. We had 8 of those dinners, and we had people like Chairman of Marks and Spencer, the chairman of NatWest Bank, you name it, they came. And I would sit there with sort of facilitating discussions with all these people. And at the end of it, realizing that a lot of them were concerned, again, about the weaknesses of capitalism, the lack of legitimacy of capitalism, the fact their youngsters didn't want to go anywhere near a business career, the fact that Exxon Valdez had happened, and they were concerned, I remember one of the big guys in Grand Metropolitan, his son in America wouldn't go near an Exxon petrol station. All of these people were sensing, they were smelling the coffee, if you like. And all of that came together when we wrote the letters to people saying we propose a tomorrow's company inquiry into the role of business in a changing world. I think we had 80 people through those dinners, and 20% of them signed up to be part of an inquiry where they were committing the time of their chief executive or one of their top people and the money to make it happen, which is extraordinary. We caught the mood of the moment.
Yeah, so the mood of the moment. So this is 1996, I think, and so it's the same year that I started working on a magazine called Management Today. And just to set the scene, perhaps for our younger listeners, it's a while ago now, and so you'd be sitting around, sort of talking about these sorts of issues. What sorts of issues back then were you discussing, and and how? Or maybe you'll tell me that they're all exactly the same issues in different forms, perhaps. But you tell me. I mean, what sorts of things were you talking about back in 1996?
Well, they're mostly quite familiar. I mentioned Exxon Valdez. That was symptomatic of the growing concern about the environment. It wasn't necessarily, only a few real visionaries at that time were talking about climate change per se, but or biodiversity in those terms. But I can't remember when Rachel Carson's Silent Spring had come out, but there was concern about the environment was definitely there. Concern about short-termism, the feeling that the city was very powerful, but it didn't allow companies to invest in R&D, and you could have a good company suddenly lose its way after a takeover. That was definitely there. The feeling about, there's a whole issue, I think, about people and what motivates them to work in a business, and the effect of the short-termism, the effect of the excessive focus on finance. The phrase fat cats was emerging during that time. I mean, one of our sponsors in that original inquiry was British Gas, and quite soon after they agreed to sponsor us, there's a man called Cedric Brown who was in all the papers, as you'll remember, as having his sort of snouts in the trough for bonuses and so on. So that became an issue. There were companies who were learning from Japan. Unipart, who were one of John Neal of Unipart was one of the early supporters. And of course, they were pioneering new approaches to supply chain relationships, which of course has made Unipart a fantastic success since. So learning from lean and all of those areas, those were issues. It was a time of total quality. I remember it was a time when the British Quality Foundation was being formed as well, and we found we had a lot in common with them. So I think those were probably the big issues. Globalization wasn't quite the big scene yet. 10 years later, we did an inquiry called Tomorrow's Global Company. That at that time, it was much more about the UK and why are we so uncompetitive? Again, familiar themes, Yeah. Why isn't the economy growing?
I've got a feeling that will be a familiar theme in some year for many years to come. Now, so there you were, an independent sort of think tank, but in your mind, were you also sort of running a business? Were you thinking as an entrepreneur? Was your mindset that of an entrepreneur?
Yes, with one qualification, which was that it was very much that some of the chief executives involved in the inquiry, who at the end of the inquiry said to me, Mark, I don't know if you realize what a success this has been, and you shouldn't stop doing it. Don't go back to the day job. And at the RSA. So then, yes, that set me thinking, well, what sort of, if they're challenging me to set up an organization, what does it look like? Is it a charity? Is it a consultancy? And I was helped by another inspiring man who'd been a member of the inquiry team called Dick O'Nions, who sadly died a few years later. He was worked for Barings. He was Barings Venture Capital Partners, that part of Barings. And he was a great advisor, coach to entrepreneurs. And I remember ringing him up every Sunday morning, his poor family, to say, Dick, I've been thinking about this, I've been thinking about that, how do I do it? And he helped me find one philanthropist. When we eventually decided we would set it up as a charity, he helped me find a philanthropist called Alan Willett, who generously put in some serious seed money for the first 2 years and indeed became our first chairman. But yes, from those moments on, especially under Dick's tutelage, I was thinking like an entrepreneur. This thing has got to fly. It's got to have a regular source of income. What's the business model? Yes, absolutely.
And to the practical experience of actually doing that, did that also then sort of feed back and sort of shift your thinking about actually running a company, or these principles that I'm talking about, or these philosophies? Actually, it's quite hard, this, and actually now I can see it in a slightly different perspective.
Completely. And this, to this day, I believe, is a missing element in a lot of the debate about responsible business, because starting a business is what feeds the economy for the future. If you don't have people starting businesses, you don't have that future. Dick understood that perfectly. And Dick O'Nyans, who gave a great lecture about this, which was called Making Small Fortunes, based on the joke that the best way to make a small fortune is to start with a big one. But Dick understood this. And in fact, I remember him during the course of the inquiry, he encouraged me to go to Silicon Valley. And there was an RSA fellow out in Silicon Valley called Andy Thompson. I remember spending a week with and interviewing people like the guys who started Intuit and meeting Sequoia Capital and people like that. That was a fascinating experience because, again, one was understanding the ecology of entrepreneurship. And what is missing in so much of the debate today about responsible business is, you can see it actually in the founders of B Corp. The founders of B Corp were inspired to start B Corp because they founded a business and then they sold it to an inappropriate owner who stopped the yoga classes and all the perks for employees and started to behave ruthlessly. And they went, we've got to create a form of certification and get companies to put things in their articles that mean that this doesn't happen. But to me, the point those guys were missing was, why didn't you stop and think about who you were selling the business to? Because these moments of transition, the dynamic nature of an economy, you start a business, but what happens to it? Who do you sell it to? What outside finance do you bring in? And people don't give enough thought to the role of ownership, the influence of the providers of capital, and to the whole dynamic nature of the economy as companies go from entrepreneur startups right through to hopefully still entrepreneurial but mature continuing companies.
So that's a really interesting sort of point about sort of like a kind of missing link. I think you were describing it as. With let's talk a little bit more about your journey with Tomorrow's Company. I mean, maybe you could just take me through how the company itself has sort of changed over time. I mean, when we were discussing this before the interview, you kind of made a kind of cryptic comment about failure being the real teacher, if you like. I mean, maybe you can sort of take me through that. I mean, along the bumps on the road as well as the as well as possible. Just give me a sort of little warts and all kind of synopsis of the journey of the business in the meantime. So,
well, I truly believe that failure is a great teacher, and failure is often a great door opener. I think if I hadn't actually been in a very unsuccessful job after I left paper manufacturing, I went into printing, and it made very clear to me by my new employers that I wasn't a success and I might consider seeking employment elsewhere. I was feeling a bit of a failure at the time. Charles Handy rang me up, and he had actually rung me up before, about 6 months or so before. And I had at that time said, oh, no, I'm too busy trying to make a success of this job. And I'd looked that gift horse in the mouth. So I think failure is you need, in some ways, to have the humility of failure to make you perhaps that little bit more desperate about being the entrepreneur. That's one thing. But the story and some of the near-death experiences that Tomorrow's Company has been through. So there was phase one, was the momentum from the inquiry. Fantastic. Income in corporate membership form. That's the business model. Then starting to do further projects. We started to do a project on the annual report of the future, for example. That was great. Then we realized we were beginning to run out of momentum. And there was a very nasty period after about 8 or 9 years where we'd built up greater overheads than we could survive with. We came through that, and the next big breakthrough was in 2005 when we managed to persuade BP to put very serious money into a project in tomorrow's global company. And BP in turn introduced us to Infosys in India, and we had a fantastically successful recruitment. This was the sales campaign of which I'm proudest, where I managed to recruit, I think it was at least 12 global companies to support the inquiry, 2 of them in India, big companies in other parts. ABB, for example, was another one. So that was a great success. And with that, we came out of that inquiry in 2007 with fantastic reserves. And I made a choice at that point, which I now think was the wrong choice. I thought, well, what I've always learned about founders is they hang around too long. I should get out and find somebody else to be chief executive. Well, actually, I think I was wrong. My successor was a great success for a few years, but long term, somehow I still wanted to make a contribution, but I wasn't chief executive. So I was kind of holding my own voice back because I didn't want to inhibit my successor. It became an uneasy relationship. And in the end, we were running out of ideas. And in fact, the trustees wanted to wind us up. And the trustees said, we're not viable. We're in danger of trading insolvently. And I had to do an emergency fundraising, which was possibly the toughest 6 months of my life. It was incredibly stressful. And I don't quite know how it happened, but one particular generous philanthropist who I didn't even know valued tomorrow's company particularly came to our rescue. And we were able to shrink down and start again. But the condition was I was back as chief executive. So I'd stopped being chief executive. Now I was back and we were starting to build again.
So there's 2 kind of, near-death experiences, as I think you described them there. So the one where you thought, oh, we're beginning to run out of money, and about 8 or 9 years. I think a lot of people who have been in business initially, they kind of feel, oh, well, everyone says that 3/4 of businesses go out of business in the first 2 years. And then you get through that and you're actually, surviving and profitable. And I think that there is a wall, if you like, there are a lot of businesses kind of come up against where it's not that they are doing anything different, but maybe the environment around them has changed. There's external things sometimes, the world has changed. I think,
yes.
It's probably a simple way of putting it. And was it one of those things, do you think, where you had to recognize the world was changing? And also, I'm just interested in that period where suddenly a door opened, with BP and then suddenly whoosh. I mean, were you sort of glad? I mean, obviously you were glad you sort of hung on at that point, but was there a moment where you were about to throw in the towel on that one then, where, just before the BP sort of thing sort of happened, and suddenly you got loads of businesses? And then the second question is, sort of takes us up to, sort of the relationship, sort of like when you handed over to somebody, you were holding yourself back. I mean, do you think you were a good person in the background? I mean, were you restraining yourself, and you then that person who said, I'll save the business if you get back involved, were you reluctant to get back involved, or had you by that point decided, yeah, actually, I do want to be in charge again?
The first near-death experience, I think we got through that because we were doing an inquiry at the time into, you may remember, into the investment system, and it ended up being called Restoring Trust. It was chaired by Sir Richard Sykes. And I think when we got into trouble over that one, and we said, look, we haven't recruited as many supporters as we thought for this inquiry, and the chief executives involved in that one counseled me and said, well, why don't you go back to the people who supported in the first place and said, we need more finance to see this through. And because they believed it was valuable, and because they could see our track record, they were prepared to give us an extra round of funding. So in a sense, we earned our survival from that first one. I think in the second one, we had run out of the goodwill. And in the second one, it was about my personal conviction and 1 or 2 other people who there were moments when I said, I think I'm going to have to throw in the towel. And there were 1 or 2 people, including a man called Peter Ward, who's our chairman now. Don't give up, Mark. This is, we believe in tomorrow's company. You'll find a way through. And they were important people. And in that second one, But the difficulties, yeah, they were enormous, and one was absolutely dancing on the edge of the cliff of insolvency. And I remember having to give there was one meeting of trustees where I said, look, I think I've raised £180,000 and I think we're going to be all right. And there was one guy there who was a specialist in these things that one of the trustees had brought in, who said, I don't believe you. And I remember saying, okay, I'm going to make a personal guarantee. If the money doesn't come forward, I didn't know where I would, but I will make it up, because I believed, and I wasn't at that moment going to let it go. So Sometimes it is about that absolute gut belief. You've got something here and you're not going to let go.
Right. So let's move on from that point where you took the reins up again to the kind of the current day. I mean, you're well known for your work in things like corporate governance, CSR, and sustainability, and these are areas that a lot of people are talking about now in a different way. How has the work evolved since that time?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because when we said in 1994, when we published our interim report, that purpose and values are at the heart of what a business should be about, people thought we were smoking something strange. And I've watched the successive decades as purposeful business has become a cliche. And of course, I've watched it with slightly mixed feelings, because it's an irony, isn't it? If you want to achieve change, you have to find words that people can relate to. But when people really relate to those words, the words after a time almost lose their meaning as they become so popular. And I've seen that happen with the word purposeful. So I think it's a good thing, but I also think that we mustn't suspend our critical thinking. And in fact, today, one of the projects that I'm involved in now with Tomorrow's Company, together with friends from an organization called Responsible 100, is trying to examine what actually underlies the meaning of the word purposeful business. And I'm coming to the conclusion that people use it in two completely different ways. I call it, I stole this phrase from somebody else actually, there's big tent thinking and there's exclusive brethren thinking. The big tent people say, I don't mind what the ownership of the company is. I don't mind what, within reason, I don't mind what the business of the company is. But if it's doing its thing well, if it's taking a good balance between short and long term, if it's being a good steward of the earth's resources and so on, good luck to it. The exclusive brethren side of purposeful are people who say, oh, well, if you happen to mention you like shareholders, then you're really beyond the pale. And this is a little bit what has worried me about B Corp, which I think is a fantastic movement. But the trouble is, there is this sort of disapproval of providers of capital, as opposed to the attitude that, well, we need to get the right providers of capital. So that is a debate that I think has moved on in all kinds of interesting ways. If I can just add one thing, the concept of stewardship is one I'm very proud Tomorrow's Company really introduced into the debate about the responsibilities of investors. And it so happened we were doing so at a time when the financial crash of 2008 was just happening. And I think that concept is so important, because I think it derives really from an understanding of what a really well-run family business is like, and how the best family businesses renew themselves from generation to generation. I also think the concept of stewardship is absolutely vital and needs more attention when you look at the way in which we regulate business. The way we regulate business at the moment, we are dominated by these neoliberal economists who think that the only thing that matters is price competition. And you've seen water regulators where there's been enormous focus on whether that there's price transparency. Well, that's not the major issue. Why don't the terms of reference of regulators start with an obligation to take care of the needs of the next generation, i.e. stewardship? And the Welsh, to me, are a great inspiration in this, because the Welsh have this Act of Parliament about the well-being of future generations, and they have a commissioner for future generations, and they scrutinize each piece of new legislation to say what's it doing for the next generation.
Okay, so I've got another question now, which is more about now we're here in the present day. I mean, what are the biggest lessons that you have learned along the way? I think there's things that we all do that help us succeed, and we can talk maybe if you picked out one or two of those things, but also things that perhaps even now you still get wrong to this day. I mean, maybe you could tell me a bit
Mm.
about the things you've learned on that sense.
Gosh, how long have you got? One of the things I've learned, I think, if for anybody starting a business is don't underestimate the importance of building up reserves. Your reserves are what give you your freedom of maneuver. And I bitterly regret the fact that in 2007, when I stopped being chief executive, we had fantastic reserves. And I was as responsible as all the other trustees in allowing that position of strength to be weakened. That's one thing. I think the second thing I'd say that I know about myself is that I'm not tough. I'm not ruthless enough. If somebody is not going to succeed, it's not actually that helpful or kind to them to allow that situation to develop. I think the third thing I've learned about myself and about building organizations is how important partnerships are. So internal partnerships, Dick and Irons talked about this in that wonderful lecture I mentioned earlier. Internal partnerships where your co-conspirator has the strengths that you don't have. And as I look to the future now, I'm very pleased to see I'm working with younger people with whom I'm enjoying that kind of internal partnership. Somebody like John Maguire, who's leading our education work, is an example. And I mentioned Responsible 100 as an organization with whom we're beginning to work as well. So I think both internal and external partnerships are vital to success. And there's a couple of times I've been approached by other people saying, couldn't we partner you in this? And I actually wish I'd taken them more seriously than I did at the time.
Okay, one thing I want to pick up there on that, because I think it takes us full circle, if you like, in this discussion. You're talking about, the energy that you might sort of pick up from working with younger people, with sort of different insights, and you also earlier on in this interview mentioned about academic work and how sometimes academic work, can't remember exactly how you put it, but you said can take away from an entrepreneurial sort of confidence or an ability confidence. I'm just interested. So is this new generation of young people, or have they sort of survived this sort of academic suppression, if you like, of their comments? I'm just interested in what you meant by that when you were talking about, because I thought it was a tremendously interesting point, and obviously maybe this is the right context in which to sort of reintroduce what you meant by that.
Yes, I think we have a real problem with the assumptions on which our secondary education system in particular is based. It's based on the assumption that you go through many years of study, you get a qualification, which then means you can start work. It's nonsense. What education needs to become is a constant iteration between concept and experience, between theory and practice. What we're doing with the work we're now which my colleague John Maguire is now leading, and now into our third group of academies, and which we hope to grow more, is work with these 15 or 14-year-olds to whom we're saying, here's a whole series of skills you're going to need later on. And by the way, among you, you may not realize it, you have business ideas. And if I tell you that in the first project that we did, which was in a school in Mansfield called the Sandworth Church Academy, there are about 4 really good business ideas came out of a group of 15-year-olds who regarded themselves as failures at school. One of those ideas, a year later, has now actually been provisionally accepted by a commercial manufacturer who is likely to take it into production. That's an extraordinary sign that we need to value the things that academic education doesn't value. And I would go further and say that I think there's a real danger for this country if we don't give young people, all of them, a non-academic experience of becoming a citizen, by which, in crude terms, I mean bring back national service, but not necessarily military service. I mean, give people 6 months to a year of citizens' experience where they are serving somebody else, whether they're serving, looking after dependent people with learning difficulties, migrants, you name it. And that experience will teach them things about themselves, which will be so valuable, will teach them they have gifts they never knew they had. And then when they go to university, if they go to university or if they go into apprenticeship, they will find those experiences are actually making their university experience or their apprenticeship experience much richer too.
There's so many lessons in there from Mark. I mean, this is the man who was talking about the big corporate issues, but way before the rest of us were. And as you just heard, he's passionate about harnessing the entrepreneurial spirit into young people. I also love his honesty in his own failings about his own journey. I mean, failure is a great teacher, he told us. And Mark also discussed the importance of building up reserves in business, and that's invaluable if rarely given advice, and why you sometimes need to take tough decisions, along with the importance of partnerships. He was fascinating on all of those subjects. So thank you to Mark, and thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate and review through your usual podcast provider. And if you want to find out more about the Merri-Cast or our business Merrible Media, you can find us on LinkedIn. Don't forget to join us for our next episode. And until then, thanks for listening.